So the A7 IV was released in late 2021. It's been about a year and a bit with this camera. It's been an incredible camera for my production and obviously for my content creation with YouTube and Instagram and all those kind of things. That 7K sensor that downsamples to 4K, it's just super sharp. Dynamic range is extremely good. One of the best in the Sony range. It's just an overall amazing camera, but we have to address the elephants in the room. All these other cameras coming up, you know, the Lumix S5 Mark II is an incredible camera and does rival this one, but so does a few Canon cameras and so does some, you know, Fuji cameras as well. We've got a lot to get through, but you have to think about the full ecosystem in the end, and is this going to suit you guys in your workflow? And you're probably thinking, I've got the A7 IV, maybe I'll jump ship and put my toes in the water somewhere else. Just wait a second, we've got a lot to get through. The timestamps will be below, so let's get into this video. So let's talk about some of the specs of the A7 IV, some of the pros, some of the cons, and then we'll talk about some of the competition that are coming up that actually may be coming in 2023 as well, but also present right now as time of this recording of this video. So let's get into the specs. So the A7 IV is a 33 megapixel full frame BSI CMOS sensor. It has a 7K sensor that downsamples to 4K and is able to shoot up to 60 frames per second with a Super 35 crop. It has the ability to do 10-bit 422 internal. It can do 1080p at 10-bit 422 at 120 frames per second. It has a dedicated photo and video switch, which is extremely good for hybrid shooters who need to retain the settings in the photos, switch it over to the video, and also have those video settings retained as well. It has the ability to do 33 megapixel photos up to 10 frames per second in burst mode. And some of the cons, it does suffer from a little bit of rolling shutter, so a lot of people, when it comes to sports and wildlife and whipping the camera around, you will notice this, but it really depends on what you're actually filming or photographing. This may not actually worry you one bit. Now the overheating, a lot of people are getting overheating. I've never had overheating with the A7 IV, especially if you do switch it into high temp mode. You shouldn't have any issues, and I'm not sure why people are still getting issues, but they may actually have faulty devices. I'm not 100% sure if they're actually following all the steps as well, but overheating shouldn't really be an issue, but for some, it is. And there is that 4K 60 crop, and I know a lot of people don't like it because if you got that lens on there, it does crop in by 1.5 times and you have to switch out the lens, or, you know, this could be quite detrimental to workflow and trying to keep things quite fast on a certain situation. But I know a lot of people actually wanted full frame, and then if it's just line skipped or pixel binned, doesn't matter. At least they don't have to change the lens, but you are sacrificing dynamic range and the sharpness of the image. And there isn't 4K at 120 frames per second at the moment. That's pretty much just for the A7S3, FX3, FX6, and the Sony Alpha 1. Image quality is one thing that is probably the hardest thing to judge with the A7 IV. I've compared this against the A7R5, the A1, the FX3, A7S3, the FX6, FX30, all those kind of cameras that are pretty much the newer ones, the top end range. And image quality, it's just really hard to say because it really depends on what you want. It really depends on what the client wants, what is actually required for any specific job or platform that you're actually going to be uploading this to. Like, let's say for instance, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all those kind of platforms, a high resolution, really sharp image probably is going to look better than a softer, lower resolution sensor because it just, I don't know, looks sharper, and on the smaller screens, you pretty much can't tell the difference. So a downsampled sensor like the A7 IV, because it's 7K that downsamples to 4K, it's gonna look sharper than the A7S3 or FX3 because they're only 12 megapixel sensors. Well, effectively 10 megapixels when it comes to shooting 16:9. But if you're filming for something a lot larger like TV screens or cinemas, the FX3, A7S3, FX6 might actually be more beneficial because it's got the lower resolution. Essentially, the pixel density is different compared to the A7 IV. The low lights is going to be obviously a lot different as well. It just really depends. Image quality is a really tough topic to really discuss because it's all up to the individual and the job that you're actually going to be filming for. Now, before we start talking about competition when it comes to other brands and other camera models and stuff, we need to talk about what's in Sony as well because, you know, believe it or not, A7R5, the A1, A7S3, FX3, FX30 is also competition with the A7 IV, which a lot of people are actually comparing the A7 IV against the FX30 because in terms of APS-C, it can shoot up to 4K 120 frames per second, which the A7 IV doesn't do. It can only do 1080p at 120 frames per second. So these are the kind of things you really need to consider. And you know, the A7R5 essentially is a 61 megapixel sensor. Sure, it films 4K 60 with that crop and doesn't do 120 frames per second. It's the same as 1080p at 120 frames per second, but it has that high resolution sensor. It has the ability to film in 8K. So essentially that is competition for the A7 IV as well. But when it comes down to the price, that's where these cameras actually do differ because sure, the FX3 is a very similar price to the A7 IV. The A7 IV is a little bit more expensive, but then you know you have the A7S3, which is that tier above. You have the FX3, which is the tier above that again. You have the A7R5, which is even a higher tier, and the A1 is up there as well. So pricing has a lot to do with where these cameras are actually placed and what the specs actually are in the specific cameras. So once again, you have to understand what camera is more beneficial in your situation and go towards that camera. But if the A7 IV still suits your needs, that's the one you should probably go for. Okay, now let's talk about the competition. The Lumix S5 Mark II. That thing is a sub $2,000 camera. It offers pretty much what the A7 IV does, but just a little bit more. The IBIS is a little bit better. It does have new phase detection autofocus, which a lot of people were actually waiting for a very long time. And that's why Lumix hasn't really been a competitor in the industry literally until now. The autofocus is actually usable and very reliable in comparison to, you know, Sony and Canon. It has the ability to do 6K open gate, which, you know, the A7 IV is capped at 4K. Sure, it does have that 7K downsample, but you aren't able to film in 7K, whereas this one has 6K and it can actually record open gate, which is the 3x2 sensor. It has a whole bunch of other recording options, which is incredible, but it does also have that 4K 60 crop as well. And when it comes to photography, it can do up to 30 frames per second in stills, which is incredible because the A7 IV is only capped to 10 frames per second in burst mode. So that is a big difference when it comes to sports and wildlife photography. And it does have a faster readout at 21 milliseconds, whereas the A7 IV has 26 millisecond sensor. And also you do have the Canon R6 Mark II, which has only just been released over the last couple of months, and that is a really good option as well. So it really comes down to how you shoot and what you actually need when it comes to photography or videography. But you have to think about the ecosystem. Sony have APS-C cameras, Sony have full frame cameras. They have a whole bunch of Sony lenses in the G Master range, the G range, the lower end range as well, third party with Tamron, Sigma, so many other really cheap manual options like Meikey, Sure, DZO film. There's so many lenses out there that you can choose from, which Canon unfortunately has blocked a lot of those lenses. So the ecosystem is extremely important here, especially if you dual wield, have a couple of cameras, have the A7 IV, you have the FX30 as a B cam, and you're still able to utilize those lenses on your B cam as well, or vice versa. But knowing that APS-C lenses will obviously have that noticeable vignetting, but with the A7 IV, you can throw it into APS-C crop mode and still use APS-C lenses pretty much native, just like you would on an APS-C sensor. And if you are working with other photographers or videographers and you need some of their footage, Sony just happen to have cameras that pretty much everyone has. So if you're trying to match colors out there, you're still going to be able to match someone else's footage, even if it is in the A7R line, or if it's the A7S line or the FX line, you're still going to be able to match the colors because they do have very similar color signs. They're not exactly the same between each models, but they are still very similar. And with the 10-bit 422, you're able to push and pull the colors really easy and be able to match the colors so much faster. I think at the end of the day, you just really need to sit down and think, what do I actually need out of the A7 IV? Am I a professional photographer? Will the A7 IV do with its 33 megapixel stills? In most scenarios, absolutely it will do. But if you do need more resolution, the Alpha 1 or this A7R series is probably the one that you're going to go for, because you do have a stacked sensor in the A1, you've got a really high 61 megapixel sensor in the A7R5 or A7R4, really depends on what you go for there, but they're pretty much suited towards photographers And videographers, the A7S, FX3, FX6 are the video first cameras that you probably want to go for because they are optimized for video. Whereas the A7IV is a hybrid camera and it does pretty much everything really, really well. And you can pretty much get away with any situation whatsoever. When it comes to real estate videography, obviously it does have its cons with that 4K 60 crop, it doesn't have 4K 120. So these are the things you really need to consider. Are there workarounds? Absolutely. You can still film in 1080p or use a wider lens, to account for that 4K 60 crop. So it really depends on what you're actually utilizing this camera for. What are the pros and cons? Does it actually suit the way that you're currently photographing or filming? Are you a videographer? Are you a photographer? There's a lot of questions you need to ask yourself, and you just have to understand the pros and cons. And I would obviously recommend going against jumping ship, because jumping ship all the time, you're gonna have to sell the lenses, sell the cameras, and all these kind of things, and it just becomes quite annoying. Try just go the lateral jump and go to a different model, like I said. That's probably your best option here. I think overall, the A7IV is still going to be a good camera in 2023, maybe even 2024. It's still going to be quite relevant. Obviously, 4K 60, 4K 120 will definitely be up there in pretty much every consumer camera in 2023, 2024. That's pretty much a given because the way that, the current situation is right now with all the cameras, that's starting to become apparent. So if you do need that 4K 120, then that's when you have to jump over to a different model. If you need higher resolution, jump to different models. But I think the A7IV is going to do extremely well for a lot of people. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. That would be absolutely amazing. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. The link will be in the description below if you do want to check out a whole bunch of my other videos when it comes to the A7IV. I've got a ton out there with setting it up and lenses and pairing other things up with it. So yeah, check those ones out. And I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.